This audio is recorded by John Loth. It's intended for educational purposes. If you find value in these works, and if you'd like to assist me in the production of these recordings, head over to my website where you can donate as little as $1 to help me continue making these. I really appreciate all your help. Thanks for having a look and a listen. Your friend, John Loth. Between Two Ages by Zbigniew Brzezinski. Chapter 5, Part 2. International Prospects. Tension is unavoidable as man strives to assimilate the new into the framework of the old. For a time, the established framework resiliently integrates the new by adapting it in a more familiar shape. But at some point, the old framework becomes overloaded. The new input can no longer be redefined into traditional forms, and eventually it asserts itself with compelling force. Today, though the old framework of international politics, with their spheres of influence, military alliances between nation-states, the fiction of sovereignty, doctrinal conflicts arising from 19th century crises, is clearly no longer compatible with reality. Indeed, it is remarkable how rapidly the dominant moods have changed during the last 2 decades. The 1950s were the era of certainty. The two sides, communist and Western, faced each other in a setting that pitted conviction against conviction. Stalinist Manichaeans confronted Dulles' missionaries. That mood quickly gave way to another, with Khrushchev and Kennedy serving as transitions to an era of confusion. Dissension in the communist world prompted an ideological crisis, while the West increasingly began to question its own values and righteousness. Communist cynics confronted liberal skeptics. There are indications that the 1970s will be dominated by growing awareness that the time has come for a common effort to shape a new framework for international politics, a framework that can serve as an effective channel for joint endeavors. Yet it must be recognized that there will be no real global cooperation until there is far greater consensus on its priorities and purposes. Is it to enhance man's material well-being and his intellectual development? Is economic growth the answer, or is a massive international educational effort to be the point of departure? Should health have priority? How is personal well-being related to the perhaps less important but more easily measured gross national product? Is there a necessary connection between scientific advance and personal happiness? There is already widespread agreement about the desirability of cutting arms budgets and developing international peacekeeping forces. There is also a more self-conscious awareness of man's inherent aggressiveness and of the need to control it. Totally destructive weapons make the effects of conflict incalculable, and thus reduce the likelihood of a major war. Here, again, an emerging global consciousness is forcing the abandonment of preoccupations with national supremacy and accentuating global interdependence. In the United States, this growing international awareness has sometimes taken the form of greater sensitivity to the influence of the military-industrial complex, and it has effectively obstructed the unlimited development of biological, chemical weaponry and its use in combat. It has also stimulated pressures for a re-examination of defense requirements, while in other advanced countries, particularly in Japan and Western Europe, it has prompted strong pacifist movements. Nonetheless, a realistic assessment compels the conclusion that there will be no global security arrangement in the foreseeable future. The most that can be expected, and effectively sought, is a widening of arms control treaties, some unilateral restraints on defense spending, and some expansion in UN peacekeeping machinery. The conflicts between nations are still very real. Readings of world change still differ sharply, and national aspirations remain divergent. Moreover, unlike the situation in Japan, Western Europe, and the United States, neither in the Soviet Union nor in China is there any public discussion of weapons development and defense spending. Secrecy and censorship impose restraints on views that diverge from the official position, and thus limit the influence of a growing global consciousness on policy choices open to the leaders of these states. The picture is somewhat more ambiguous in the fields of economic and educational scientific development. All major countries now accept the principle that they ought to aid the less developed countries. This is a new moral position, and it is an important component of the new global consciousness. Though nations still assert their sovereignty in fixing the scale of aid extended, most make less than 1% of their GNP available. They have, in effect, created a binding precedent. The extension of aid has become an imperative. It seems likely that in the years to come, despite persisting conflicts among states, economic aid will grow in scale and be used less and less as a vehicle of political influence. At the same time, however, short of a very major crisis, it seems unlikely that aid will be forthcoming in amounts sufficient to offset the threatening prospects discussed in Part 1. In some respects, technological scientific developments augur more promise for the rapid global spread of educational programs and of new techniques. Television satellites are already making regional educational programs possible, as in Central America, and there has been progress in setting up regional technological institutes. This might eventually reduce the brain drain, which is caused in part by the temptations inherent in resident studies in the more advanced countries. The Development Assistance Committee of OECD offers the potential for a systematic approach to meeting the educational needs of the less developed countries, and unlike UNESCO, it is not subject to political pressures from them. Such an approach would be consistent with the emergence of a more cooperative community of the developed nations, one able to adopt a common development strategy. The spread of English as a global scientific language is accelerating the formation of a global scientific family, increasingly mobile and interchangeable. Yet this progress could be vitiated in many countries by a social incapacity to digest and absorb the positive potential inherent in educational and scientific growth. Their inadequate economic resources, only marginally augmented by reasonably foreseeable foreign aid, may even cause some positive changes to backfire, prompting not social advance, but costly conflict, not policy innovation, but political paralysis. Indeed, our still limited knowledge of the factors inducing social development, and of the role played in that development by religion, culture, and psychology, hinders the formulation of an effective strategy for the dissemination of technical know-how and for the application of material aid. In this setting, which combines rudiments of order and elements of chaos, two general prospects, both more immediately relevant to the United States foreign policy, seem probable. First, the Third World, though it will obviously continue to experience turbulent changes, is not very likely to be swept by a common revolutionary wave. Second, the Soviet Union will, in the foreseeable future, remain too strong externally not to be a global rival to the United States, but too weak internally to be its global partner. The revolutionary process. The concept of an international revolution inspired by a common ideology had some meaning when the Industrial Revolution seemed to indicate that certain forms of social organization and of social crisis had a general application. The view combined a universal intellectual perspective with a geographical historical parochialism. It assumed, in part because information about world processes was relatively limited, that a common global framework could be postulated on the basis of the historical experience of a few Western countries. It is now increasingly evident that social conditions, as well as the way in which science and technology are socially applied, vary enormously, and that this variety includes very subtle but important nuances of cultural, religious, and historic tradition, in addition to economic and technical factors. Moreover, in Russia and in China, the revolutionary intelligentsia of the late 19th and early 20th centuries was itself in the forefront of the process of modernization. It represented the most advanced segments of society, and hence a political victory by it inherently involved a historical step forward for the society as a whole. This is no longer the case. The revolutionary intelligentsia in the less developed countries, to say nothing of its vicarious middle-class intellectual equivalents in the United States, often represents a social anachronism. As far as the modernization process is concerned, this intelligentsia has been left behind by developments in science and technology, in which it is largely illiterate. It is possible, therefore, that in some countries, perhaps even the more modern ones, these anachronistic intelligentsias may even succeed by clinging to essentially aristocratic and anti-industrial values in effectively blocking the modernization of their societies, by insisting that it be postponed until after an ideological revolution has taken place. In this sense, the technotronic revolution could partially become a self-limiting phenomenon. Disseminated by mass communications, it creates its own antithesis through the impact of mass communications on some sectors of the intelligentsia. In some of the developing countries, this might eventually pit the traditional humanist legalist trained intelligentsia, who are more receptive to doctrinal appeals, against the younger, more socially concerned and innovative officers, engineers, and students, who have combined to effect a modernization that is indigenous and socially radical, though programmatically eclectic. In Latin America, the more extreme reforms may be more reminiscent of Peronism and fascism than of communism. By 1970, the student population will be approximately 1 million, thus creating an ambitious and politically volatile base for reform. In addition, by the opposition of Latin American governments to United States economic and political influence, and their inclination to undertake radical domestic reforms, may be expected to increase, but to do so within a framework that combines a more socially responsible Catholicism with nationalism, in a setting of considerable national diversity. This will produce a highly differentiated pattern of change, but even its radical manifestations are not likely to be molded on communist countries, especially since the relative cultural sophistication of the Latin American elites reduces the appeal of the stodgy Eastern European or Soviet models. The officer corps, composed of socially radical and technologically innovative younger officers, is more likely to be the source of revolutionary change than the local communist parties, and Latin American discontent will be galvanized not by ideology, but by continuing anti-Yankeeism, pure and simple. In other parts of the globe, similar combinations probably will result in regimes that will compensate for the weakness of indigenous religions and intellectual traditions by being doctrinally oriented. Iraqi and Sudanese coups of the late 1960s, carried out by alliances of officers and intellectuals, will probably be repeated elsewhere in Africa and the Middle East. There is, however, some reason for skepticism concerning the genuineness and depth of the ideological commitment of these new regimes. Some of their ideology is shaped by extraneous factors, the question of Israel, and of the Soviet attitude. Some is merely currently fashionable rhetoric. Much of it is highly volatile and subject to drastic changes. Doubtless, these regimes will be assisted and exploited by the Soviets and the Chinese. The latter, for example, have already made political inroads into East Africa. Even so, it will still be more a matter of tactical cooperation than of actual control and a common strategic policy. Similarly, in South and Southeast Asia, revolutionary patterns are likely to have an essentially indigenous and differentiated character. It is quite possible that the two large political units, India and Pakistan, which combine a variety of disparate economic and ethnic entities, may split up. This will be especially likely as the present elites, whose internal unity was forged by the struggle against the British, fade from the scene. The waning of the Congress Party in India has been accompanied by intensifying ethnic stresses and by the polarization of political opinions. Should the Indian Union break down, Southern Tamil separatism, probably left-wing radical in orientation, would be contested by Northern Hindu right radicalism, perhaps more religiously oriented. Each would tend to intensify the doctrinal and indigenous distinctiveness of the other. As happened earlier in China, any tendency toward communism that might result from such a confrontation would soon be culturally absorbed and perhaps overwhelmed by the weight of economic backwardness. In China, the Sino-Soviet conflict has already accelerated the inescapable Sinification of Chinese communism. That conflict shattered the revolution's universal perspective and, perhaps even more important, detached Chinese modernization from its commitment to the Soviet model. Hence, whatever happens in the short run, in years to come, Chinese development will probably increasingly share the experience of other nations in the process of modernization. This may both dilute the regime's ideological tenacity and lead to more eclectic experimentation in shaping the Chinese road to modernity. Many of the upheavals in the Third World will unavoidably have a strong anti-American basis. This is likely to be particularly true where American presence and power has traditionally been most visible. In areas near the Soviet Union and China, however, anti-Soviet and anti-Chinese attitudes are likely to predominate in the long run, irrespective of the character of the internal reforms and of the external complexions of the ruling regimes. This again highlights the point that the revolutionary process, as such, will not necessarily determine the foreign policy stance of the new elites, which is more likely to be shaped by a combination of traditional antipathies, current fears, and domestic political needs. Moreover, the basic orientation of the new elites will more and more respond to the intellectual impact of domestic changes in the more advanced world, changes directly and personally visible to these elites through travel, study, and global mass media. This intimacy with life abroad will further reduce the importance of integrative ideologies, which had previously provided a substitute for a clear vision of the future and the outside world. Ideological uniformity was the prescription for remaking a world that was both distant and largely unknown. But proximity and global congestion now dictate revolutionary diversity. Accordingly, the real values, as distinguished from the rhetoric of the aspiring elites of the developing nations, will be shaped by tangible development rather than by abstract generalizations. The success of the United States in shaping a workable, multiracial democracy while pioneering in science and technology, the ability of Europe and Japan to overcome the psychological and social stresses of mature modernity, and last but not least, the degree to which the Soviet Union breaks away from the doctrinal orthodoxy that inhibits its social development, will be critically important in shaping the outlook of the Third World leaders. USA, USSR, less intensive, more extensive rivalry. The extent to which Americans view revolutionary changes abroad as automatically inimical to their interests reinforces the extent to which these seem beneficial to the Soviets and can be fitted into a global communist framework. Conversely, the extent to which America views these changes in a neutral light diminishes the intrinsic attraction of the Soviet model for Third World revolutionaries and encourages indigenous factors to surface more rapidly. The Soviet attraction has already been weakened by the appearance of states more militant than the Soviet Union and of groups more activist than the pro-Soviet Communist parties. The Soviet appeal has also declined because internal Soviet bureaucratization and dogmatic restraints on intellectual creativity and social innovation have made the Soviet Union the most conservative political and social order of the more advanced world. American-Soviet rivalry is hence likely to become less ideological in character, though it may become more extensive geographically and more dangerous in terms of the power involved. Increased direct contacts between the two nations, restraints imposed by mutual recognition of the destructiveness of present weapons systems, and lessened ideological expectations for the Third World could make American-Soviet relations more stable. Nevertheless, more and more areas on the globe could become the objects of moves and countermoves if the growth in long-range Soviet military forces, particularly conventional air and sea lift capabilities, extends American-Soviet rivalry to areas previously considered beyond the Soviet reach. Instability in the Third World could tempt either state to employ its power to offset or preempt the other, thereby creating situations analogous to the Fashoda incident, which, at the end of the 19th century, almost caused a war between France and Britain, at a time when these powers were moving and continued to move toward a European accommodation. On the whole, close cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union seems a very unlikely prospect in the coming decade. This is only partially due to the different ideological and political character of the two countries. A communist America would in all probability remain a rival to the Soviet Union, just as communist China soon became one. Given its size and power, a democratic and creative Soviet Union might be an even more powerful competitor for the United States than is the present bureaucratically stagnant and doctrinally orthodox Soviet system. Moreover, democratic nations are not necessarily pacifist nations, as American history amply demonstrates. Rivalry between nations is inherent in an international system that functions without global consensus, the result of centuries of the conditioning of man's outlook by competitive nations that insisted on their individual superiority and particular values. Such rivalry is not likely to be terminated by anything short of a fundamental reconstruction in the nature of relations between nations, and hence in the character of national sovereignty itself. At present, the formation of a new cooperative international pattern is getting little help from the Soviet Union, in spite of the fact that it considers itself in the forefront of historical progress and was until recently the standard bearer of an ideology that had cut across traditional national lines. The irony of history is such that today the Soviet Union has a foreign policy that is intensely nationalistic and a domestic policy that calls for the domination of non-Russian minorities. It actively campaigns against regional patterns of international cooperation, grants a disproportionately small amount of help to the less developed nations, roughly 10% of United States foreign aid, and rejects a joint exploration of space, cloaking its own efforts in utmost secrecy. Indeed, one of the unanticipated effects of the Sino-Soviet dispute may be a hardening of the Soviet outlook and a more paranoid view of the world. Though Soviet leaders want to avoid a two-front confrontation and are hence pushed toward accommodation with either the West or the East. The very scale of the Chinese challenge intensifies their fears, puts a premium on military preparedness, and stimulates an intense preoccupation with the sacredness of frontiers. Equally important, but less generally recognized as a factor in inhibiting the Soviet Union from seeking more binding formations of international cooperation, is the domestic weakness and insecurity of Soviet leaders. Even 50 years after its inception, the political system they head still lacks elementary legitimacy. Its ruling elite relies heavily on coercion and censorship to retain its power, which is acquired not by regular constitutional procedures, but through protracted bureaucratic infighting. The struggles for succession are a case in point. Because of the doctrinal incapacity of the Soviet political system to respond to the internal needs of social innovation, broad accommodation with the West, carrying with it the acknowledgement that the Leninist dichomatic vision of the world, which in turn justifies the Leninist concept of the ruling party, is no longer relevant, would inevitably cause far-reaching international political instability in the Soviet Union and in Soviet-dominated Eastern Europe. In large measure, the conservative Leninist attitude reflects Russia's delayed modernization and political development. In terms of the global city, the Soviet Union represents an archaic religious community that experiences modernity existentially, but not quite yet normatively. Policy implications. The foregoing general propositions point to several immediate implications for American foreign policy, in terms both of guiding assumptions and of the desirable foreign posture. Before elaborating, let us first posit these implications in their most succinct form. A posture based on ideological considerations has become dated. An American-Soviet axis is not likely to be the basis for a new international system. Traditional spheres of influence are increasingly unviable. Economic determinism, in regard to the less developed countries, or to the communist states, does not provide a sound basis for policy. Regional alliances against individual nations are becoming obsolescent. An extensive American military presence abroad is becoming counterproductive to American interests and to the growth of an international community. American diplomatic machinery, developed in the pre-global and pre-technotronic age, has become outmoded and requires extensive modernization. Although American foreign policy has not been as undifferentiatedly anti-communist as its critics have found it convenient to assert, there has been a strong rhetorical tendency in American official circles to reduce international problems to an ideological confrontation and to identify radical change as contrary to American interests. Henceforth, local transformations in various parts of the world are less likely to be seen as part of a universal threat. In addition, the gradual pluralization of the communist world will continue to accelerate differences among the communist systems. This will reduce reliance on active American intervention, making it imperative, primarily in defense of concrete American interests or in response to an overall hostile act by a power with the potential to threaten the United States. A less ideological perspective will reduce the American-Soviet relationship to its proper proportions. The principal threat the Soviet Union poses to the United States is military. A stronger Soviet Union, therefore, inescapably tends to threaten America. A weaker Soviet Union feels threatened by America. Since a war between the two superpowers would be mutually destructive, arms control arrangements between the two countries are dictated by common sense. The continuing SALT, that is, Strategic Arms Limitation talks, between the United States and the Soviet Union can be seen as more than a negotiation between two rivals. Inadvertently, precisely because they will be lengthy, the talks signify a de facto beginning of a joint commission on arms and strategy. Although limited in actual power, the commission, gradually and perhaps increasingly, will affect the way each side acts, stimulating greater mutual sensitivity to felt needs and fears. In the meantime, until a binding agreement is reached, American technological sophistication is sufficient to provide the necessary degree of ambiguity to the qualitative and quantitative power relationship between the two states. In the current phase of destructive parity, the strategic and psychological posture is needed in order to replace earlier reliance on manifest and credible deterrence, born of American superiority in destructive power. Parity deterrence requires some ambiguity, just as superiority deterrence demanded precise credibility. But outside this relationship, the opportunities for a wide-ranging settlement are relatively restricted. An American-Soviet axis would be resented by too many states and therefore tempt both Washington and Moscow to exploit these resentments. In effect, the more successful the efforts to create such an axis, the stronger the impediment to it. In addition, as has already been argued, the Soviet Union does not represent a vital social alternative that offers the world an attractive and relevant model for handling either its old dilemmas or, particularly, the new ones posed by science and technology. As a result, the most that America can reasonably seek is a gradual increase in Soviet involvement in international cooperation through such projects as joint space exploration, undersea studies, and so forth. Cumulatively, these may help shape a pattern of collaborative involvement that will eventually embrace other spheres. Meanwhile, it is likely that American and Russian influence will decrease in areas that both nations have traditionally considered their own special domains. In a modern city, staked-out areas are possible only in relations among criminal gangs. In the global city, sealed spheres of influence are increasingly difficult, or at least costly, to maintain. Eastern Europe is bound to remain attracted to the West, and only direct Soviet coercion can impede what would otherwise happen quite rapidly: the linkage of Eastern Europe to a larger European entity. Even Soviet force will not be able to halt this process entirely. The traditional cultural attraction of the West is too strong, and it is currently reinforced by growing Eastern European recognition that, because of the technological gap between the East and the West, Russia cannot effectively help Eastern Europe to enter the post-industrial age. This attraction is healthy, for the gradual expansion of Eastern European links with Western Europe is bound to affect the Soviet Union as well, and lessen its doctrinal orientation. The notion of a special relationship between the United States and Latin America is also bound to decay. Latin American nationalism, more and more radical as it widens its popular base, will be directed with increasing animosity against the United States, unless the United States rapidly shifts its own posture. Accordingly, it would be wise for the United States to make an explicit move to abandon the Monroe Doctrine and to concede that in the new global age, geographic or hemispheric contiguity no longer need be politically decisive. Nothing could be healthier for Pan-American relations than for the United States to place them on the same level as its relations with the rest of the world, confining itself to emphasis on cultural political affinities, as it does with Western Europe, and economic social obligations, as it does with the less developed countries. It would also be advisable to view the question of the political development of both the communist and the developing countries with a great deal of patience. Just as the infusion of American power may not always be the solution, so reliance on economic growth is no guarantee of either democratization, political stability, or pro-Americanism. As has been pointed out, political change in the communist states is not a simple byproduct of economic development, and the susceptibility of the less developed countries to radical appeals rises as they begin to develop. Foreign aid and closer economic contacts are not a palliative for deep-rooted crises, or a remedy for the ills of deeply entrenched ideological institutions. This argues for an approach to international economic relations and foreign aid that is increasingly depoliticized in form, even if the ultimate underlying purpose remains political. If that purpose is to promote the emergence of a more cooperative community of nations, irrespective of their individual internal systems, then it would be a step in the right direction to give international bodies a larger role in economic development and to start eliminating restrictions on trade. Such action is all the more likely to be eventually successful because it is less overtly political and not geared to expectations of rapid and basic political change achieved through direct economic leverage. A more detached attitude toward revolutionary processes and a less anxious preoccupation with the Soviet Union would also help the United States to develop a different posture toward China. China and South Asia are heavily populated areas that have inherited from the past complex challenges to social organization and are still struggling with these old problems at a time when the advanced world is beginning to confront problems of new dimensions. Until links are established with China, and these can initially be sought and directed through Japan and Western Europe, China will remain an excluded and a self-excluded portion of mankind, all the more threatening because its backwardness will increasingly be combined with massive nuclear power. Accordingly, the United States, instead of becoming an indirect Soviet ally against China, which is what Moscow obviously wants, should encourage efforts by other countries to seek ties with China. In addition, it should launch its own initiatives and avoid becoming entangled in overt anti-Chinese security arrangements. Indeed, in our age, international security arrangements ought to resemble those of large metropolitan centers. Such arrangements are directed not against specific organizations or individuals, but against those who depart from established norms. Thus, an association based on a concept of cooperative nations, linked for a variety of purposes, including security, ought gradually to replace existing alliances, which are usually formulated in terms of a potential aggressor, explicitly identified either in the treaty or in the accompanying rhetoric. Though, initially, this would be only a formalistic change, for the association of states would necessarily involve only those that share certain interests and fears. A deliberately open-ended structure, with the security elements only a partial and secondary aspect, would avoid perpetuating institutionally the inevitable but often transient conflicts of interests between states. Evolution in the forms of international security would facilitate the gradual restructuring of the American defense posture, particularly by concentrating American military presence abroad in a few key countries. Except in countries that feel themselves directly threatened, prolonged United States military presence tends to galvanize political hostility toward the United States, even in traditionally friendly countries like Turkey. And though that presence was once wanted by the countries concerned, it has tended to become an American vested interest. With the restraint imposed on the waging of an all-out war by the destructiveness of nuclear weapons, and with the likelihood that sporadic Third World violence will replace the previous preoccupation with a central war, American forces stationed abroad on the assumption that they will be needed to assure the security of different nations from a common threat are less and less required for that purpose. With some exceptions, for example, South Korea, Berlin, or West Germany. By and large, both global stability and American interests would probably not be jeopardized if the American defense posture became territorially more confined. This has been true of the Soviet Union, with little apparent damage to its security, and relied increasingly on long-range mobility. Finally, the opportunities and the dangers inherent in the scientific technological age require subtle but important changes in American attitudes and organization. These changes will not come rapidly. They cannot be blueprinted in detail. They are unlikely to be achieved dramatically. Nonetheless, to play an effective world role, America needs foreign relations machinery that exploits the latest communications techniques and uses a style and organization responsive to the more congested pattern of our global existence. This is hardly the case today. Our diplomatic machinery is still the product of the traditional arrangements that were contrived after 1815 and that were ritualistically preoccupied with protocol. It is predominantly geared to government relations, often neglecting the currently more important role of social developments. It is no accident that newspapermen, less dependent on governmental contacts and more inclined to become absorbed in a given society's life, have often been more sensitive to the broad pattern of change in foreign countries than have the local American diplomats. Contemporary foreign relations increasingly require skills in intellectual, scientific communications, including the ability to communicate effectively with the creative segments of other societies. And it is precisely in these fields that the existing diplomatic training and procedure are most deficient. Moreover, the entire tradition of secret dispatches and lengthy cables, which daily overwhelm State Department headquarters in Washington, has simply not taken into account the explosion in modern communications, the development of excellent foreign reporting in the leading American and foreign newspapers, and even the role of television. In commenting on the 1969 Dukin Report, which was similarly critical of the British Foreign Service, Canadian political scientist James Ears noted, quote, "Too many people push too many pens across too many pieces of paper, filling them with worthless messages." Close quote. Thomas Jefferson once complained that he had not heard from one of his ambassadors for a year. The present Secretary of State could legitimately complain that he daily hears too much from too many unneeded ambassadors. The United States is the country that most urgently needs to reform its foreign service and policy-making establishment, and it is best equipped to undertake such reform. It is the first society to become globally oriented, and it is the one with the most extensive and intensive communications involvement. Its business community, moreover, has also acquired extensive experience in foreign operations and has effectively mastered the arts of accurate reporting, foreign representation, and central control, without relying on enormous staffs and redundant operations. It has also pioneered in the adoption of the latest techniques, such as closed-circuit television conferences, shared-time computers, and other devices. Though this is hardly the place to outline the needed reforms in detail, the point remains that given the fundamental changes in the way nations interact, an extensive study and drastic reform of the existing highly traditional structure and style of the American Foreign Service is long overdue. Wider diplomatic use of computers and direct sound and sight electronic communication should permit the reduction in the size and number of United States foreign missions, making them operationally similar to the more efficient international corporations. Washington's policymaking process needs to be similarly streamlined and freed from its tangle of bureaucratic red tape.